The handkerchief dropped at exactly the wrong moment. That it was silk, ivory white, embroidered in the corner with a crest Sarah Bellamy didn't recognize. It belonged to the man standing by the window, the one who had been standing there for the better part of an hour, untouched by conversation. Undisturbed by the careful choreography of Lady Mortimer's drawing room. He hadn't moved when the footman stumbled against the curtain rod. He didn't move now, even as the handkerchief settled onto the Persian rug like a small surrender. Every guest in the room saw it fall. Sarah saw it too. From her chair in the corner she had quietly claimed as her own since arriving in London 3 weeks ago. She had learned, in those 3 weeks, to occupy as little space as possible. To accept invitations graciously and speak only when spoken to. To be present without being noticed, which was, her cousin Margaret had explained, an essential skill for a young woman of limited means and no useful connections. "You are here to be seen in the right rooms," Margaret had said, on the first morning. With the careful kindness of someone explaining rules to a person who hadn't grown up knowing them. Not to be remarked upon. Sarah had been trying very hard not to be remarked upon, what she had not yet learned, what no one had explained. Because everyone else already knew was why not a single person in Lady Mortimer's drawing room was willing to walk 12 feet across a rug to return a handkerchief to its owner. She watched. A footman near the fireplace glanced at the silk square on the floor, then at his fellow. Then developed a sudden interest in the middle distance. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been positioned closest to the window, turned to examine the garden outside with an attention the garden had not previously warranted. 2 young gentlemen by the door discovered urgent business with their cufflinks. Even Lady Mortimer herself, whose drawing room this was, whose carpet this was, whose guest had presumably dropped his handkerchief on Idovan, she looked at the small ivory square and looked away. The silence around the man by the window was not the ordinary silence of social indifference. It was precise, deliberate, maintained by collective agreement. The way a city maintains roads around a quarantine house: you go around it, you don't go through it, and you don't discuss why. Because the why is something everyone understood before they arrived. Sarah didn't understand it. She had not arrived knowing it, she only saw a man who had lost his handkerchief. Go on, Miss Bellamy. The voice came from her left. Low and sweetened with something that wasn't kindness. Caroline Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell's niece. Sharp-edged and socially fluent in the way that certain women became when they had spent 3 seasons learning exactly where the pressure points were, had materialized in the adjacent chair without Sarah noticing the movement. "You're the physician's daughter, aren't you?" "I am," Sarah said. "Well." Caroline's gaze moved from Sarah to the handkerchief on the floor and back again, the trajectory of it deliberate. "Surely a little proximity doesn't trouble you, given your upbringing." A pause, the length of which was precisely calibrated. "Unless your father's training was only theoretical." The word landed with the weight that certain words in certain rooms always carried, not their dictionary meaning but their social one. Sarah had spent 3 weeks learning to read this part 1. Cular vocabulary. Theoretical meant, your father worked with his hands. Theoretical meant, whatever education you received, it was the education of a person who did things, not the education of a person who directed others to do them. Theoretical meant, you are being tested. And we are watching to see if you understand the nature of the test. She understood it was a test, she didn't understand what she was being tested against. She looked at the handkerchief. She looked at the man. He was still facing the window, hands clasped behind his back. The line of his shoulders so precisely controlled it looked less like a posture and more like a choice made a long time ago and maintained through sheer consistency. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed with the kind of simplicity that on certain men reads as poverty and on others reads as authority. On this man it read as neither. It read as someone who had stopped, at some point, caring what it read as, around him. The room had arranged itself into a circle of avoidance. The radius was perhaps 8 feet. It had the geometric accuracy of something practiced over many repetitions. She was watching a dare-be by the time Sarah fully understood that. She was already standing, the distance was 12 feet. She counted them, because her father had taught her to count things when her hands were about to do something her better judgment hadn't fully endorsed. 12 feet of Persian rug. 12 feet of collective held breath. She could feel it. The room going still the way rooms went still when something was about to happen that people wanted to watch without appearing to watch. She reached the handkerchief. Bent down. Picked it up. That it was heavier than she expected. Fine silk always was. The weight was in the weave. She straightened and found that the man had turned from the window, which meant he had heard her approach, which meant that he had been aware of the handkerchief on the floor the entire time and had simply not moved to retrieve it. His eyes were gray. Not the pale, washed-out gray of indifference, but something with more substance, darker, more considered. The gray of deep river water in November. He looked at her with an attention that was nothing like the way men at Lady Mortimer's gatherings usually looked at young women of limited fortune. He looked at her the way her father had sometimes looked at a patient who'd said something unexpected. With the focused, recalibrating attention of a person in the process of revising an assumption that he did not take the handkerchief immediately. "You're new," he said. "It wasn't a question. 3 weeks, Sarah said. "In London? In London, or in this particular room?" She considered. "Both feel approximately the same." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, exactly, but an adjacent thing, brief and quickly contained. He held out his hand. She placed the handkerchief in it, careful not to let her fingers make contact with his. Though she couldn't have said precisely why. He took it with an inch of distance preserved on his side as well, as though the same unspoken calculation had occurred to him simultaneously. That he folded it once and placed it in his coat pocket. "That I see," he said. And turned back to the window. Sarah stood for a moment in the space, had returned to ignoring her. Uncertain whether she had been dismissed or whether the conversation had simply paused beyond her ability to restart it. Then she walked back across the 12 feet of Persian rug and sat down in her corner chair. The circle of empty space around the man by the window remained exactly as it had been. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then at him. He hadn't moved. She would think about that inch of distance for the rest of the afternoon, not with any particular interpretation. Because she didn't have enough information yet to interpret it. She filed it the way her father had taught her to file things she couldn't immediately explain, carefully, somewhere accessible. For later, the gathering dispersed at 4:30. Sarah was retrieving her shawl from the side table near the door when Caroline's voice carried across the hall behind her, aimed at the two women beside her and modulated at the precise volume intended to be overheard. "Well," Caroline said. "Now she's done it." Sarah's hands went still on the shawl. "Done what, exactly?" one of the women asked. "Touched him. Or near enough." "You all saw?" "A beat. Nothing is only anything where Carlyle is concerned. You know what they say, surely it was just a handkerchief." The second woman said, with the uncertain upward lilt of someone hoping to be corrected. "His mother and sister both," Caroline said, lowering her voice in a way that somehow made it carry further. "Summer of 1815. The illness. He was the only one who didn't." She stopped, reconsidered. "Selected a different approach. He's been to every drawing room in London since it happened. Standing exactly like that. No one quite knows why he keeps coming, given that no one quite knows how to." Another pause. Richly suggestive. "Well, I certainly wouldn't touch anything that belonged to him." Sarah put on her shawl. She walked to the door. She did not look back. Carlyle, she filed that too. The next morning she asked Margaret about it over breakfast. As neutrally as she could manage, Margaret set down her letter. The pause that followed was the pause of a woman recalibrating how much explanation was warranted. "The Duke of Carlisle," Margaret said, "is a man of perfectly respectable lineage and almost no social consequence whatsoever. Which is its own kind of position, I suppose." She picked up her letter again. "His mother and sister died in the illness of 1815. He survived. People find this." She searched for the word uncomfortable. "He reminds them of something they'd prefer not to be reminded of, that people died. That people died while other people stood at a distance and waited to see." Margaret's eyes remained on her letter. "I'd advise you not to pursue the acquaintance, Sarah. You're not positioned to absorb that kind of association. I say it practically. Not unkindly, Sarah thought about gray eyes and the careful inch of preserved distance in a handkerchief exchange. Of course. She said. You're right. She came to Lady Mortimer's library 3 days later to return a borrowed volume of natural history and selected 2 more from the shelf beside it. She had been doing this regularly enough that it no longer required explanation. Lady Mortimer was generous with her library. Or at least indifferent to its use. Which in practice amounted to the same thing. She was reaching for the second volume when the door opened, she knew before she turned. There were only a few people who entered a room with that particular quality of silence, not the silence of someone trying to be unobtrusive, but the silence of someone who had, over a long period of time, stopped expecting rooms to rearrange themselves around his presence. The Duke of Carlisle stopped when he saw her, in precisely the way she had stopped when she heard the door, a brief mutual recalibration of an expectation. Miss Bellamy, he said, Your Grace. The title came to her a half-second after the words. Assembled from Margaret's morning explanation and the crest on the handkerchief and the way Caroline had said Carlisle with that particular weight. She watched him absorb the slight delay and decide not to remark on it that I had understood the library to be unoccupied at this hour. He said that I had the same understanding. She gestured at the room. I can go. No. He said it without ceremony, already moving toward the desk in the far corner. A leather case under one arm. I require only the desk. Sarah turned back to the shelves. She found her second book. She was preparing to leave when she noticed what he had spread across the desk. She recognized the format before she had made a conscious decision to look at it, the column structure. The date entries in the leftmost field. The parish markers running down the margin. Her father had kept 20 years of records in this precise format stacked in the study where she had learned to read from them before she had learned to read from anything else. She had spent 17 years with her hands in documents that looked exactly like this, the third column from the right. She looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds before she understood what she was seeing. The transcription error begins at the 14th entry. She said. Her voice came out more certain than she felt about the decision to use it. It continues to the 22nd. Someone has been recording deaths as recoveries. The pen stopped, the silence in the room changed quality, no longer the silence of 2 people occupying the same space independent. But the silence of one person waiting for another to continue or retract. That I apologize, Sarah said. I shouldn't have looked. How do you know? He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the column she'd indicated. With the focused attention of someone checking a thing against a previously held belief. My father was a physician in Herefordshire. I maintained his records for 17 years. The error pattern. She hesitated. It's consistent with fatigue transcription. Someone copying figures at the end of a long day, I drifting 1 row upward. You see it in the dates as well. If you look at entries 16 and 17. That he looked at entries 16 and 17. Then, without particular expression, he turned the record 90 degrees and pushed it across the desk toward the empty chair on the other side. Sit down. He said. Find the rest. That it was not a request. It was not quite a command either. It occupied the space between them with the grammar of someone who had set aside a familiar habit, the habit of directing rooms, and replaced it with something more immediate. Something that sounded, to Sarah's ear, almost like, I need this and I don't know who else to ask. She sat down. She found 9 errors in 14 minutes. She knew the duration because he was watching the clock on the mantelpiece in a way that was just visible in her peripheral vision. And she had inherited from her father the particular attentiveness to being observed that made you count things. When she set down the pen, he looked at the corrected figures for a long moment. Your father trained you to do this. He said that he trained me to look at what was actually there. She said. The recording came with it. Where is he now? The question was asked the way he seemed to ask everything, directly, without the social padding that made questions easier to hear and harder to answer honestly. He died. Sarah said. 3 years ago. A fever. The same kind had spent his career treating in other people. She didn't qualify it. Didn't soften it. Her father had not been a man who found comfort in the softening of true things. And she had not grown up learning to perform it. Carlyle looked at her for a moment. The expression on his face was one Shed seen once before by the window. When Shed handed him his handkerchief, the expression of a person updating a previously held position. There are 6 more volumes of the 1815 figures, he said. He stood. Gathered his coat from the back of the chair. "I'll need the same cross-check applied to all of them. That I am not employed by Lady Mortimer," Sarah said. No. He picked up his case. "Come back Thursday." She won't object. He left. Sarah sat at the desk for a moment longer, looking at the 9 pencil marks Shed made beside the errors. Small, precise, her father's notation system applied to someone else's data in someone else's library. Outside, a clock marked the quarter hour. She thought about Margaret's advice, which had been practical and not unkind and almost certainly correct. She thought about 9 errors in a mortality record from 1815, each one a number that had been wrong for 7 years. And the particular quality of a man's voice when he said "I need this" without using those words. She came back on Thursday. Thursday came with the particular grey light that London produced in October. The kind that made everything look like it was happening slightly behind glass. Sarah arrived at Lady Mortimer's house at 11. Which was the hour she had calculated as least likely to overlap with morning calls and most likely to give her 3 uninterrupted hours in the library before the household began preparing for afternoon visitors. She had brought her own pencils. She had also brought the notation system her father had developed over 30 years of practice. A small folded paper in her coat pocket, the kind of reference she no longer needed but carried anyway, because it had been his handwriting and she was not yet ready to leave it at home. The 6 volumes were already on the desk when she arrived. He was not there. She sat down, opened the first volume, and went to work. He arrived 40 minutes later with no announcement and no apparent awareness that arriving 40 minutes after the agreed time without explanation might warrant one. He set his case on the corner of the desk, looked at the open volume in front of her, and looked at the 3 pages of corrected notations she had already produced. "You started without me," he said. "You weren't here," Sarah said, without looking up. A pause. "No," he agreed. "I wasn't." He sat down across from her and opened his own volume. For a while there was no sound in the library except the occasional soft turn of pages and the scratch of pencils, which was, Sarah thought, a remarkably comfortable silence for 2 people who had spoken to each other on only 2 previous occasions. She found this worth noting. Most silences with people she had recently met required maintenance: small sounds, occasional glances, the subtle social labor of demonstrating that the silence was companionable rather than hostile. This one required nothing. He worked. She worked. The grey October light moved across the desk at the pace that grey October light moved. At 11:30 she found something that wasn't a transcript. Ion error. She looked at it for a moment, looked at the surrounding entries, went back 3 pages to check the pattern, and came forward again. "There's a second category of problem," she said. He looked up. "These aren't transcription errors." She turned the volume so he could see the entries Shed marked. "These deaths have been recorded correctly, but they've been attributed to the wrong cause. Someone has been classifying fever deaths," as she checked the column header, "as constitutive tinal weakness consistently, across a specific geographic cluster. Southwark, primarily." He was very still. "Why would that matter?" she asked. Not rhetorically. She genuinely wanted to know whether had seen this already or whether she had found something new. "Because constitutional weakness doesn't require a public health response," he said. "Fever does." He looked at the entries. If these deaths were recorded as fever, the parish would have been obligated to report to the Board of Health. As constitutional weakness, they simply— He stopped, disappeared, Sarah said, into the record. He looked at her. "How many, in this volume alone?" 43. She paused. "I haven't checked the others yet." He looked at the stack of remaining volumes with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something that had been contained for a long time, encountering new information and calculating what the new information changed. "Check them," he said. She checked them. By the time the clock struck 1, The number was 207. They sat with that figure for a moment in the gray library light. 207 deaths reclassified out of visibility. 207 people who had died in Southwark in the summer of 1815 and been recorded as having simply been too constitution. Ally fragile for the world, rather than having been failed by it, your committee, Sarah said carefully. The public health legislation. Would this? It would change the evidentiary basis entirely. He said. The argument against mandatory reporting has always been that the 1815 mortality figures don't support the scale of intervention in proposing. He looked at the corrected tallies. These figures do. Sarah looked at her pencil marks across 7 volumes of records. Small, precise. Her father's notation system. She thought about her father driving to Southwark twice a year to exchange notes with the physicians there. She thought about his files, which were still in Margaret's spare room in 40 cardboard boxes, which she had not opened since the funeral because she hadn't known what to do with them. Why father kept records too, she said. Clinical records. Not parish mortality records. But he saw patients in Southwark when the regular practitioners were, she chose the word carefully, unavailable. I don't know if they overlap with what you have here. He looked at her with the full weight of that recalibrating attention. Where are these records? He said, Margaret's spare room. Can you access them? They're mine, Sarah said. He left everything to me. Another silence. Different in quality from the working silence of the previous 2 hours. This one had the weight of a question being formed and the weight of what the answer might mean. Thursday, he said finally, meaning, she understood, the following Thursday, meaning bring them, Thursday. She agreed. She walked home through the gray October light with the folded paper of her father's notation system in her pocket and the number 207 somewhere in her chest, not quite settled yet. Looking for where to land, the 40 boxes arrived on the following Thursday in Margaret's second-best cart, which Margaret lent without asking questions, which was its own form of generosity. Sarah spent that week in the spare room with a candle and her father's filing system, which was logical in a way that required knowing how he thought to follow. She had grown up knowing how he thought. By Wednesday evening she had identified 11 boxes that were relevant, organized by year and parish, and had written a summary index on 6 sheets of paper in her neatest hand. She brought the index on Thursday and left the boxes in Margaret's spare room. Because they were not hers to move without knowing what they were being moved into. He read the index in silence, then he read it again. These are clinical observations, he said. Not just mortality counts. He recorded symptoms, duration, progression. He thought the pattern mattered. Sarah said. He couldn't get anyone official to agree, so he kept recording in case she stopped. In case someone eventually wanted to know was what her father had said. In the specific tone he used when he had decided to be patient about something that was making him furious. In case the data became useful, she finished, it's useful now. He set down the index. I'd like to see the boxes. I'd like to know what for, Sarah said. He looked at her not with impatience. She thought, but with the slight recalibration of a man who was accustomed to requests being met with logistics rather than conditions. The legislation, he said. The committee requires an evidentiary basis for mandatory fever reporting. Your father's clinical records, combined with the corrected mortality data, would provide exactly that, and after the legislation passes, the records would be archived with the committee, where they would be attributed to. A pause. The committee's research, he said, carefully. My father spent 20 years on those records. Sarah said. She kept her voice even, because she had learned from him that the even voice was the one that got heard. He died before anyone wanted to see them. I'd like his name on whatever they become part of. The pause this time was longer. That's a reasonable condition, he said. Yes. Sarah agreed. It is. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, not the recalibrating gun assumption expression, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked, she thought, like a man encountering a kind of straightforwardness he hadn't expected from this direction and finding he had no objection to it. His name will be recorded as a contributing source, he said. I'll put it in writing if you'd like, please, Sarah said. He wrote it down. On a sheet of paper from his case, in a hand that was precise and slightly angular. He signed it and pushed it across the desk to her. She folded it and put it in her pocket, beside the notation paper. Thursday, he said, which had become, in the past 2 weeks, a word that meant several things at once. Thursday, she said that it was Caroline who first used the word alone. Sarah heard it at Mrs. Pemberton's Tuesday gathering, in the 3rd week of October. In the particular carrying undertone that Caroline had apparently been born knowing how to deploy. Alone in Lady Mortimer's library, Caroline was saying to someone Sarah couldn't see, from behind a large arrangement of autumn flowers. On multiple occasions. I don't say it critically, I'm sure there's a perfectly innocent explanation. Though one does wonder what explanation Miss Bellamy intends to offer, if anyone were to ask directly. Sarah, standing on the other side of the flower arrangement with a cup of tea she had not touched in 4 minutes, said nothing. She waited until the conversation had moved to safer ground. Then she set down her tea, collected her shawl, and exchanged the appropriate farewell pleasantries with Mrs. Pemberton, who pressed her hand with slightly too much warmth. The warmth of a woman offering comfort preemptively. She walked home and did not tell Margaret what she had heard. She told herself it didn't matter, but the following week, 2 invitations she would ordinarily have received did not arrive. The week after that, Lady Hartwell, Caroline's mother, looked through her at a milliner's shop with the clean precision of someone who had made a decision and was executing it, and no one said anything directly. No one needed to. The machinery of it was entirely silent, and entirely clear, and it had been running. Sarah understood, since the moment she had walked 12 feet across Lady Mortimer's drawing-room rug. She had not stopped going to the library on Thursdays. She told herself this was because the work mattered, and the work did matter. She was certain of that. In the way she was certain of things her father had taught her. 207 people. 40 years of clinical records. A piece of legislation that could change how the city responded the next time the fever came. She told herself this. She was fairly sure it was true. She was less sure Tea was complete. The collapse happened at Mrs. Alden's Wednesday gathering, which was larger than Lady Mortimer's affairs and louder, and therefore provided more cover for the kind of thing that wasn't supposed to happen in drawing rooms. The gentleman's name was Mr. Forsyth. He was perhaps 60. Florid, and had been standing too close to the fireplace for too long with a glass of something that wasn't his first. Sarah noticed him listing slightly to the left at 3:15. She noticed the color in his face, which was the particular high red of a man whose heart was working harder than it should. She noticed his right hand go to his chest, briefly, in the way people touched a thing that was bothering them before they decided to admit it was bothering them. She set down her tea. Around her, the gathering continued. 12 women and 4 men distributed across 2 sitting rooms. The sound of conversation maintained at the pleasant consistent volume of people who had known each other long enough to talk without particularly listening. No one else was watching Mr. Forsyth. There was no reason they should have been, had not yet done anything worth watching that he went down between 1 second and the next. The way heavy things fell, completely, without stages, the room lurched into a different kind of noise. Sarah was already moving. She reached him before any of the footmen, knelt on the carpet without considering the carpet, and opened the small leather case she carried in her coat pocket, her father's last gift to her, a physician's emergency kit reduced to its essentials, which she carried the way other women carried smelling salts. Because her father had believed in the smelling salts of actual utility. His pulse was present. Irregular, but present. His color was beginning to shift from red to something grayer. Loosen his collar, she said. To no one in particular and everyone in general. Someone behind her complied. And move back needs air, not an audience. The audience moved back approximately 2 feet and then stopped, which was human and predictable. She worked. She had done this before, not often. But her father had brought her to 3 emergencies in the last year of his practice. Believing that watching was how you learned what reading couldn't teach. She knew what to do with her hands. She knew how to keep her voice even when her pulse was not demar. Forsyth's color was improving by the time the footmen had organized themselves into usefulness. By the time Mrs. Alden's person, physician arrived 20 minutes later. He was conscious and annoyed about it in the way that men of his age and constitution were often annoyed about episodes that had frightened them, as though the boat's failure was an embarrassment to be managed rather than information to be attended to. The physician, a young man named Graves, recently established in the neighborhood, looked at Sarah's work with an expression that cycled through surprise, assessment, and something that resolved into professional respect. "Nicely done," he said quietly. "My father was Thomas Bellamy," she said. Hereford. He knew the name. She could see its small recognition, the slight shift in how he was looking at her. "I've read his fever papers," he said. "The ones he submitted to the society in 1812. They rejected them," Sarah said. "They were wrong to," Graves said simply. And turned back to his patient. She was putting her case away when she became aware that someone was standing at a slight distance behind her, not crowding, not speaking, the stance of someone who had been watching for long enough to see the whole of it and was waiting until she was finished. She turned. Carlyle was standing perhaps 6 feet away, which was closer than he stood to most people in most rooms. He had come to Mrs. Alden's. She realized she hadn't seen him when she arrived, which meant had arrived later, or she'd been insufficiently attentive. He looked at the case in her hands, then at her. "Your father gave you that?" he said. "It wasn't a question, the week before he died." She fastened the clasp. "He said it was impractical to carry, but that impractical things were often the ones worth carrying." Something moved through his expression, brief, and quickly contained, and not quite gone. "He said that?" "He said that. He said a great many things in that last week." She pocketed the case. He was a man who had been patient for a long time about a number of things and had decided he was running out of time to stay patient. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Alden supervising the removal of Mr. Forsyth to a more comfortable room, and the gathering reconstituting itself around the drama of his recovery, the noise of people who had witnessed something and were now converting it into a story they could tell later. "In this room," Carlyle said, his voice low enough that it was only for her, "you just knelt on Mrs. Alden's best carpet and put your hands on a man's chest in front of 40 people, yes?" Sarah said, "And you understood what that would look like." She met his gaze. "I understood what not doing it would look like more." He was quiet for a moment. The noise of the room went on around them, carefully not touching the small space they were standing in. "Your father taught you that too?" "He said that. He taught me not to look away when looking away was easier," Sarah said. "That's all it was." He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, something that wasn't the recalibrating look, something slower and more careful than that. As though he were adding this to a collection of things he was keeping track of and wasn't sure yet what the collection was for. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. She was almost at the door when she heard Caroline's voice from the other side of a floral arrangement, carrying its customary precise distance. "Well, I suppose when one has nothing to lose by way of reputation, one can afford to be dramatic about it." Sarah did not stop walking. The Thursday after Mrs. Alden's gathering, he was already in the library when she arrived. This was unusual. In the 6 weeks of their Thursday arrangement, she had always arrived first. She had come to think of those first 40 minutes alone with the volumes as a kind of calibration, the work settling her into the right kind of attention before he arrived, and the work became something with a witness that he was standing at the window, not working. Standy. It was the same posture she'd seen at Lady Mortimer's drawing room in the first week of October, hands at his back, shoulders in that controlled line that was less a posture than a decision. But in Lady Mortimer's drawing room he had been surrounded by 40 people performing their careful avoidance. Here there was only Sarah, and the grey November light, and the 6 completed volumes stacked on the desk between them. She set down her coat. She sat down. She waited to see if he would turn. After a moment, he did. "I want to show you something," he said. "Not here. If you're willing." The hospital was in Southwark, on a street that Sarah knew from her father's record. She had cross-referenced the address 3 weeks ago without registering it as anything other than a data point. From the outside it was an unassuming stone building, 3 stories. The kind of functional architecture that announced itself as serious about its purpose and indifferent to aesthetics. The door had a name carved into the lintel, in memory of Eleanor Carlyle and Francis Carlyle. That no one should wait alone. Sarah read it twice. She did not say anything immediately. She had learned, in the weeks of Thursday silences, That some information needed a moment before a response was the right thing, they went inside. It was clean in the particular way that institutions were clean when the people running them genuinely believed cleanliness mattered rather than performing belief in it. The ward they walked through held 20 beds, most occupied. The patients were from Southwark, could tell from the faces. From the particular quality of exhausted patients that belonged to people who had not expected to be cared for and were still slightly surprised by it. A nurse nodded to Carlyle with the ease of long familiarity. He was known here. He was known here differently than he was known in Lady Mortimer's drawing room, without the careful radius of avoidance, without the managed distance. He stopped at 2 beds to speak to patients by name. Sarah walked beside him and did not perform any of the reactions she felt when they came back outside. The November light had shifted into the particular bronze of late afternoon. Eleanor was my mother, he said. Frances was my sister. She was 16. He said it the way people said things they had said before, to themselves. In the repetition that was required before a thing became bearable rather than impossible. Summer of 1815, Sarah said, July. He was looking at the name above the door. I was in Edinburgh. A committee meeting. Ironic. In retrospect. I received the message on the 14th and took the first coach south. He paused. It took 2 days. By the time I arrived. He stopped. Sarah waited. The housekeeper had barricaded herself in the kitchen, he said. With 2 of the maids. The footmen had left on the 12th. The physician stopped coming on the 11th because he chose the word with precision, because he had decided the risk to himself outweighed his professional obligation. Another pause. My mother's water glass was empty. She had been asking or water for I don't know how long. There was water in the house. There was no one willing to carry it. The bronze afternoon light lay across the stone building, across the carved names. She could have survived, he said. The physician's notes, which I obtained afterward, and it took 2 years to obtain them, indicate that her case, as of his last visit, was serious but not fatal. Frances was younger and stronger. They died if he stopped again. Recalibrated, they died because no one would carry water. Because everyone decided that their own safety was worth more than the risk. Sarah said quietly, yes. She looked at the names above the door. Eleanor. Frances. The particular quality of carved stone, which was permanent in a way that other materials weren't. You know, she said, my father had a patient in 1815. A woman in Bermondsey. I cross-referenced her last month. She's in the corrected mortality data. He went to see her 4 times during the outbreak. The 3rd time, her family had left. The 4th time, she had left water beside her own bed because she'd learned not to expect anyone to bring it. What happened to her? She recovered. Sarah paused. She was in the records as a constitutional weakness death for 7 years. He looked at her. She survived. Sarah said. But the record had her dead. Somewhere in your committee's data, she was evidence that the outbreak wasn't as severe as it was. She was evidence against the thing your legislation is trying to do, past tense. He said, past tense. We corrected her in the 3rd volume. October 14th. She's a recovery now. Sarah looked at the door. I don't know her name. Just her address and age. 23, in 1815. The silence between them was the particular silence of 2 people who had arrived from different directions, at the same understanding of something. Not comfort exactly. Something more structural than comfort, the kind of quiet that came when a thing had been looked at directly and found to be exactly as difficult as it appeared. And you were still standing. My father used to say, Sarah said, that the most dangerous thing in medicine wasn't the disease. It was the decision to look away. She turned from the door to find him already looking at her. He said it to me when I was 8 and I didn't fully understand it. I think I understand it now. When did you understand it? When I was standing in Lady Mortimer's drawing room, she said, looking at a handkerchief on the floor. Something happened to his expressions, low and complete, and not quickly contained this time. You knew what you were walking into, he said that I knew it was a dare. She said. I didn't know what I was daring. She looked at the names again. I think I know now that he didn't answer immediately. The late afternoon light was moving off the stone, the November cold beginning to assert itself in the way it did when the light went, your father. He said finally. Did he know his records would be used for this? He knew they should be, Sarah said. He spent 20 years knowing they should be and being told they weren't the right kind of evidence. She paused. I think he would have found it. She looked for the right word, and found it. And it was her father's word satisfying. That someone wanted to know. Carlyle looked at her for a long moment. That he would have been correct to find it satisfying, he said. They walked back to Mayfair as the light finished going. Through streets that moved from Southwark's working stone to the West End's dressed facades. The city changing character with each quarter-mile the way cities did when you paid attention. Sarah's hands were cold. She had left her gloves in Lady Mortimer's library. She didn't mention it at the corner of Margaret Street. He stopped. Your father's records. He said. The committee meets in December. If the corrected mortality data and his clinical observations are presented together. They should be presented together. Sarah said that it will mean your name in the committee record as well. He said. Alongside his that I know. She looked at him. That's all right. That he nodded, once, in the way he agreed to things without surplus. Then he said, before she turned, Miss Bellamy, she waited. He was right. Carlyle said. Your father. About the impractical things, she didn't answer that. She didn't think it needed an answer. She walked home with cold hands and the names Eleanor and Francis somewhere in her chest, settled now, landed. Taking up the space they were going to take up for a long time. The tea was at Mrs. Pemberton's, on a Thursday in late November when Sarah had rearranged her library hours to accommodate it. Because Margaret had asked her directly and Margaret's direct requests were the kind that carried the weight of everything she didn't say alongside them, there were 14 women present. Sarah knew most of them by name now, which was different from knowing them. But was the kind of knowledge that functioned adequately in rooms like this one. She had stationed herself near the window with a cup of tea and the particular composure of a woman who had learned to occupy space without inviting conversation. Which was a skill she had developed over 8 weeks in London and was becoming, she thought, quite good at. Caroline arrived 20 minutes late, which was a choice rather than an oversight. She brought with her the atmosphere she usually brought, a slight sharpening of the room's social attention. A reorientation of smaller conversations toward her position the way plants oriented toward light, except that the analogy broke down because plants didn't have options, for the first half hour. Nothing happened. Sarah drank her tea. She listened to Mrs. Pemberton describe a new milliner on Bond Street. She watched the room do what rooms did, which was to perform itself. Then Caroline settled into the chair nearest the fireplace and said, to the 3 women around her. In the voice that carried, I heard the committee review has been delayed. Something to do with the evidentiary basis being disputed, I think was the word. Sarah did not look up from her tea. Disputed by whom? Mrs. Wentworth asked, which was the question that had been meant to be asked. Oh. I couldn't say specifically. A pause, warmly imprecise. I only know that there are those on the committee who feel the data sources are unorthodox. That the work has been done by people without appropriate credentials. Another pause. With more warmth in the imprecision. I suppose when one is determined to push through a particular piece of legislation, one uses whatever materials are available to one. However they were obtained, the room did not go silent. It went attentive, which was worse. Because it meant everyone could hear everything while appearing to be engaged in other conversations. Sarah set down her teacup. She looked at it for a moment, the small white cup on the small white saucer, both of which were Mrs. Pemberton's good china and deserved to be set down carefully. Which she did. Then she looked at Caroline. That I am sorry, she said. The room's attentiveness sharpened into something more specific. I want to make sure I've understood you correctly. Are you suggesting that the mortality records I've been cross-referencing are unreliable? Or that my father's clinical records are? Caroline's expression arranged itself into something that approximated surprise. I'm not suggesting anything about you personally, Miss Bellamy. I wouldn't presume. Then I'm confused, Sarah said, about who you mean by people without appropriate credentials. Since I'm the person who has been doing the work. My father was a licensed physician who practiced for 30 years and kept clinical records that were submitted to the Royal Society in 1812. If there are concerns about their credibility, I'd be glad to address them specifically. That I only meant. Or perhaps, Sarah said, and her voice was her father's voice now, the one he'd used when he had been patient for a long time and had decided he was finished being patient. You meant that a woman doing the work makes the work less credible. In which case I'd be interested to hear the argument. Because I haven't encountered a version of it yet that survives contact with the actual data. The room was very quiet, not the managed quiet of people pretending not to listen. The genuine quiet of people who had stopped pretending. Caroline's composure was good. Sarah gave her that. It barely sure. Feeded. I think you've misunderstood the spirit in which. My father spent 20 years trying to get someone to look at those records, Sarah said. He died before anyone did. I'd prefer not to spend the next 20 years having the same conversation he had, so if there's a specific objection to the work, please make it. If there isn't, then I'll assume we've finished. She picked up her teacup, her hand was entirely steady. This was not because she wasn't angry. She was. She was angry in the specific way her father had been angry, not hot, not volatile. But the kind of anger that had been there a long time and had learned to make itself useful. She was angry because of 20 years of records in 40 cardboard boxes in Margaret's spare room. She was angry because of 207 deaths recorded as constitutional weakness. She was angry because of an empty water glass in a house in Mayfair in July of 1815 that she drank her tea. Around her, the room exhaled carefully, quietly. In the practiced way of people who had witnessed something they weren't sure how to categorize and were choosing the safest possible interpretation until they'd had time to discuss it privately, Caroline said nothing else. Mrs. Pemberton, after a moment, said something about the Bond Street milliner that she had already said earlier, and the room accepted the offering gratefully and moved on. Sarah stayed until it was polite to leave, and then left. And walked home through the cold November afternoon with her father's case in her pocket and the particular quality of stillness that came after something had been said that had needed saying for longer than she had realized. She did not know whether it had helped or hurt. She suspected it had done off, and that this was unavoidable, and that her father would have understood exactly why she had done it anyway. That he found her in the library the following Thursday, which was where he found her most Thursdays now. But he arrived earlier than usual, before she had opened any of the volumes. And he stood in the doorway for a moment in a way that was different from his usual entries, less the silence of someone who had stopped expecting rooms to respond to him. And more the silence of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. She looked up from the index she had been reviewing. That I heard about Mrs. Pemberton's, he said. The quality of the light in the library was the particular flat gray of late November. The kind that made everything look equally weighted. Sarah set down her pencil. That I imagine several people have, she said. Several people have. He came in, but didn't sit. He moved to the window instead, not the avoidance posture she'd first seen, but something more deliberate. As though he wanted a moment to look at something other than her face while he arranged what he was going to say. Caroline Hartwell is telling anyone who will listen that you were aggressive and ill-mannered, and that it confirms everything she has always privately felt about. He paused. About women, why? Without sufficient grounding in social reality. That's one interpretation, Sarah said. It's the interpretation that's currently circulating in approximately 4 drawing rooms that I see. She looked at her index. Are you here to advise me to apologize? No. She looked up. He turned from the window. The flat gray light was behind him, which meant she was reading his expression without the assistance of direct illumination, which required more attention. She gave it more attention. That I am here, he said. Because Caroline Hartwell said your father's work was obtained by unorthodox means, by someone without credentials. And you apparently said. A brief pause, something that caused Mrs. Wentworth to tell Lady Ashford that she had never in 20 years of attending Thursday teas witnessed anything quite like it, and Lady Ashford told my housekeeper, who told me. The information moved quickly. Sarah said that it usually does, when it's interesting. He came away from the window and sat down across from her, not at the distance he'd maintained in the early weeks, the careful professional distance of two people sharing a desk, but closer. In the way people sat when they had decided to be in a conversation rather than conduct one. "What did you actually say?" she told him. "Precisely." Because she had been her father's daughter long enough to know that precision in the retelling was a form of respect for the original event, when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You said," he repeated, "if there's a specific objection to the work. Please make it.yes that I in front of 14 people." There were 14 people present. Yes, that he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, or rather, she had seen its components separately, but not assembled like this. Not all at once. The recalibrating attention was part of it. But there was something underneath it that she didn't have a name for, something that had the quality of recognition, the way people looked when they encountered something they had stopped expecting to find. "Miss Bellamy," he said. In this particular social environment, asking someone to make a specific objection rather than a general insinuation as he paused, and she thought she saw something that was not quite a smile at the edges of it. "It is, I think, the conversational equivalent of standing up in the middle of a formal dinner and requesting that everyone identify exactly which fish course they found inadequate. That I know," she said. "You knew when you said it." "Yes, and you said it anyway," she said. "My father's work was done by someone without appropriate credentials," Sarah said. "His name is going into the committee record this December." I wasn't going to sit there, and she stopped, because she was getting angry again. And her father had also taught her that the even voice was the one that got heard, and she needed to be heard. She steadied. He spent 20 years being told his evidence wasn't the right kind. "I'm not going to spend 20 minutes letting someone imply the same thing in a room I'm sitting in. If I can help it." Carlyle looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "I don't imagine you are." The flat gray light lay across the desk between them. Outside, somewhere in the street, a cart went past with a sound like the world continuing its ordinary business. "You're going to lose 3 more invitations over this," he said. "Possibly 4. Probably," Sarah agreed. "And you're not going to apologize." "No good," he said. She looked at him. "Why, mother," he said, "would have said the same thing you said." Not in the same words, she had a different vocabulary for it. But the same thing. He looked at the desk. She had a particular phrase she used when she had been patient for a long time with a particular kind of dishonesty. She said, "Name the thing you mean. Or stop meaning it." Sarah was very still. "Name the thing you mean," she said, "or stop meaning it." Yes, she thought about Eleanor Carlyle, who had kept a journal that her son had illegally preserved in a library that Sarah had been borrowing books from for 2 months. She thought about a woman who had taught her son that phrase, and about the empty water glass. And about the kind of clarity it took to hold on to that kind of language when the world kept telling you that precision was impolite. She would have been good at the committee work, Sarah said. She would have been extraordinary at it, he said. She was extraordinary at most things she decided to pay attention to. A pause, small and complete. "I think she would have found your father's records." He looked for the word, and found one that Sarah recognized as careful, vindicating that he would have used that exact word. Sarah said. They sat with that for a moment, the particular quiet of two people who had discovered that their dead were in conversation with each other across 7 years and 40 cardboard boxes and 207 corrected records. "You calculate terribly," he said. She blinked. "The social calculation. He considered remarkably bad at it. By the standard of this room, of this season. Of everything you are apparently supposed to be doing here." He met her eyes. "You said exactly the wrong thing in exactly the wrong way in front of exactly the wrong people, and it will cost you invitations, and you knew all of that. And you said it anyway because your father's name was being insinuated against." He paused. "I have been in these rooms for 3 years. I have watched a great many people calculate very carefully, and I have not once seen it produce anything worth the calculation." Another pause, shorter. "It is, I think, the most useful thing I have encountered in a drawing room since my mother died." Sarah looked at him. She had, over the past 8 weeks, become reasonably competent at reading the expressions of a man who didn't offer them easily. But this one was different from the ones she had catalogued. It was not the recalibrating attention, not the slow recognition. Not the contained but not quittigone quality of something briefly felt and quickly managed. This was something that had stopped being managed. Why father would have said, she said finally, carefully. That the best thing about terrible calculation is that you always know exactly what you actually meant. Yes, Carlyle said. That's precisely it. Outside, the cart sounds had faded. The library was very quiet in the way that rooms became quiet when the important thing in them had already been said and both people present were aware of it. Sarah picked up her pencil. There's still volume 4 to finish, she said. There is. He agreed. That he opened volume 4. That they worked until the clock struck 2, in the silence that had been there since October, which was the same silence it had always been, and also, now, something more than that. The letter arrived on a Monday, which was not a day Sarah associated with consequential things. Consequential things, in her experience, tended to arrive on Thursdays. When she was already in the library and already prepared to deal with information that required dealing with, Monday morning she was helping Margaret sort correspondence when Margaret set one envelope aside and then, after a moment, picked it up again and held it in a way that meant she had decided something. This concerns you, Margaret said. I think you should read it. It was not addressed to Sarah. It was addressed to Margaret. In the formal hand of someone accustomed to writing letters that would be read carefully. The seal was one Sarah didn't recognize. She read it was from Lord Eversham, who was, she gathered from context, a senior member of Carlyle's Public Health Committee. It was written with the careful indirection of a man who wanted to communicate something specific while preserving his ability to deny having communicated it. The substance, stripped of its indirection, was this. The committee's December presentation required the support of 3 voting members whose support was currently conditional. Those members had privately indicated that their confidence in the committee's leadership was contingent on that leadership demonstrating sound judgment in personal as well as professional matters. There had been observations made, by people whose observations carried weight, regarding the Duke of Carlisle's continued association with a young woman of limited social standing and irregular conduct. These observations had been communicated to the conditional members. The conditional members had communicated their concerns to Lord Eversham. Lord Eversham was communicating Th.M. now to Margaret, as Miss Bellamy's nearest responsible relation in London, in the hope that the situation might be quietly resolved before the December session. The phrase quietly resolved appeared twice. Sarah read the letter a second time. Not because she had missed anything the first time, but because she wanted to be certain she had understood it correctly and was not adding meaning that wasn't there. She had not added meaning that wasn't there. How long have you known about this? She asked. That I received a verbal indication 2 weeks ago, Margaret said. From Lady Hartwell. I didn't. She stopped. I didn't know how to raise it. You could have told me directly. Yes. Margaret looked at her hands. I could have. I'm sorry. Sarah set the letter on the table. She looked at it for a moment. The careful handwriting, the precise indirection. The 2 appearances of quietly resolved. The legislation, she said. If he loses those 3 votes, the session fails, Margaret said. He'd have to start again. Another year. At least. Possibly more. She paused. Sarah. I know what the work means to you. I know what your father. She stopped again. But the Duke of Carlisle has been doing this work for 3 years. He knows how these things function. He will find another approach. Another year. Sarah said, yes, there are people dying in Southwark who would not die if the mandatory reporting requirements were in place. Margaret was quiet. There were 207 people in 1815 who died and were recorded as constitutional weakness. Sarah said. That number exists because there was no mandatory reporting. Because no one was required to count correctly. Because the board had no authority to compel parishes to. She stopped. Steadied. Another year means another outbreak season without the reporting structure. It means more empty water glasses. That I know, Margaret said softly. That he needs those 3 votes. Yes. The November light came through the breakfast room window at its flat grey angle. Sarah looked at the letter. She looked at her hands on the table. She had her father's hands the same shape. The same slight roughness at the fingertips from handling paper and instruments. She had noticed this before. She was noticing it now with a particular attention, as though she was trying to fix it clearly in her mind. "I'll need to think about this," she said. "Of course." Margaret said. Sarah folded the letter with the same care she had given Mrs. Pemberton's china. She put it in her pocket. She went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall for a period of time. She didn't measure. The work mattered. The legislation mattered. The THR votes mattered. She had known, from the beginning, that she was not in a position to absorb this kind of association. Margaret had told her. She had told herself. She had continued anyway, because the work was real and the records were her father's and the 207 names were real. And she had not been able to make herself value her social position more than those things, but her social position was not the only thing at stake. She put her hand in her pocket and found the small folded paper of her father's notation system, and the letter from Lord Eversham. And held both of them for a moment without looking at either. Her father had spent 20 years knowing his records should be used. He had been patient. He had submitted the papers to the society in 1812 and been rejected and gone back to his practice and kept recording. He had not burned the RICO RDS when he died. He had left them to her. Which was its own kind of instruction. That he had also taught her that sometimes the most important thing was knowing when to stop being in the way of something larger than yourself. She was not sure which lesson applied. She was fairly sure she was going to have to decide before Thursday. She dead on Wednesday. She told herself it was the right decision, which it was. Be the logic she had applied, which was her father's logic, which valued the larger outcome over the individual cost. She told herself he would have understood, which he would have. She told herself it was temporary. Which she was less certain about. She wrote a note to Lady Mortimer requesting that her library borrowing arrangement be suspended until further notice, citing personal circumstances. She did not write to Carlyle directly, because she did not know what to say that would be both honest and kind. And she had not yet found the place where those two things overlapped. She was still looking for it on Thursday morning when she heard the knock, not at the front door, at the side entrance, the one that opened onto the narrow passage between Margaret's townhouse and the next. The knock was precise. 2, then 1, then 2. She had never heard that particular pattern before and had no reason to recognize it, but she went to the door anyway. Because there was only one person in London who communicated with that quality of intentional precision, she opened it. He was standing in the passage in a coat that was inadequate for the temperature. Which was the first time she had seen him unprepared for a physical circumstance. "You cancelled the library arrangement," he said. "Yes," without explanation. "That I didn't know how to explain it in writing," Sarah said. That he looked at her for a moment. Behind him. The passage was grey and cold and very narrow, not the kind of place a duke came to have conversations, which was perhaps why he'd chosen it. "That I know about Eversham's letter," he said. She said nothing. "Margaret received it on Monday," he said. "I received a version of the same communication from Eversham directly on Tuesday. The phrasing was somewhat more direct in mine." He paused. "He told me the 3 votes would be withdrawn if I didn't." He chose the word with precision. "Reconsider my associations, then you understand why I understand what he said," Carlyle said. "I'm less interested in what he said than in what you decided on the basis of it. The legislation needs those votes," Sarah said. "The December session. Yes, another year means another outbreak season without mandatory reporting. You know what that means in Southwark." She kept her voice even. "I'm not going to be the reason that doesn't happen. No," he said. "You're not." She looked at him. "I've been in contact with 3 members of Parliament since Tuesday," he said. "Younger men, Whitmore, Castle, and Hayes. They've been watching the committee work from the outside and have been dissatisfied, I think is the word, with the conditional nature of certain member support." He paused. "They're willing to provide an alternative evidentiary basis for the December session. One that doesn't require the 3 conditional votes. Because it goes through a different committee structure entirely." Sarah was very still. "When did you?" "Tuesday," he said. When Eversham's letter arrived, that was 2 days ago, yes, she looked at him in the grey cold of the passage. You found 3 alternative votes in 2 days that I found the conversations I should have had 6 months ago, he said. And had them quickly. A pause. I was relying too heavily on support that had always been conditional. That was my error, not yours, Carlyle. The legislation does not require you to remove yourself, he said. It never did. That was Eversham's preference. Not a structural necessity. His voice was even, but beneath the evenness was something with more pressure in it, pressure of a man who had arranged what he was going to say and was saying it the way he did things. Without surplus. I should have told you on Tuesday. I came today because you cancelled the library arrangement before I could. Sarah looked at the narrow grey passage, at the inadequate coat, at the Twothanonethantwo knock that had no precedent. You came to the side door. She said. The front door seemed. He paused, declarative, and the side door isn't. Something shifted in his expression. It's declarative in a different direction, he said. I preferred this direction. She held the door open a little wider. Which was not quite an invitation but was not the absence of one. That you said you'd find a fourth option, she said. In the library. When I told you about Eversham that I said I was looking for one, he said. I found it in 2 days that I was motivated. He said. The grey light in the passage was the same grey light that had been in the library every Thursday since October, and she thought about all the things that had been said in grey light this autumn. And all the things that hadn't needed to be said because the grey light had held them adequately. You should come in, she said. It's cold, yes, he agreed. It is. She stood back from the door. He came inside. Into the narrow hallway that smelled of Margaret's household and old wood and the particular November cold that had followed him in, and Sarah closed the door behind them both against the grey passage and the inadequate coat and the Twothanonethantwo knock that she would remember precisely. She thought, for a very long time, that I am not a distraction from the work, she said. Not a question. You are the reason the work is worth doing, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him. Why mother used to say, he said, more quietly. That the most dangerous thing was not the people who stood against you. It was the people who convinced you to stand against yourself. He paused. I'm not going to let Eversham do that. And I'm not going to let you do it either, on his behalf. With better intentions. The hallway was very small. The grey light came through the single high window at an angle that made everything look like the beginning of something. The library, Sarah said. Thursday, he said. He left through the side door, back into the passage. With the same quality of silence he brought to all exits. Sarah stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed, her hand still on the wood of it. She thought about her father's letter. Still in her pocket, she thought about the specific weight of a man who found 3 votes in 2 days and came to a side door to say so. She put her hand in her pocket and found both pieces of paper, the notation system and Lord Eversham's letter, and held them together for a moment. Then she went to find Margaret, to tell her that the library arrangement had been reinstated. The rumor reached Margaret's house on a Friday, which meant it had been circulating since at least Wednesday and had achieved sufficient velocity to arrive without a specific carrier. Margaret mentioned it at breakfast. In the careful tone she used when she had been thinking about how to raise something for long enough that the thinking showed. There is a story going around, Margaret said. That you were seen leaving Carlyle's private residence unaccompanied. Late in the evening. Sarah looked up from her toast. That didn't happen, she said. That I know it didn't happen. Margaret set down her cup. That is somewhat beside the point. In my experience. Sarah thought about the Southwark Hospital, the side entrance they had used, the street she had walked back from in the early evening. Early evening, not late. And it had not been his private residence. But the geography of rumor was not the geography of events. How widely? She asked. Widely enough that Mrs. Calder mentioned it to me yesterday, Margaret said. In the tone she uses when she wants me to know she considers herself well informed. Sarah ate her toast. She was not hungry, but her father had believed in eating when food was available. On the grounds that one could not predict when it would next be available, and the BOTUS requirements did not pause for inconvenient circumstances. Is there anything you want to tell me? Margaret asked. No, Sarah said. Because nothing happened that requires telling, Margaret nodded, slowly. In the way that meant she believed this and also understood it was not the complete picture, and had decided not to push on the distance between those two things. The invitations that week were 2. The previous week had been 4. The week before that. 6. Sarah noted the arithmetic and said nothing about it. She went to Lady Mortimer's library on Thursday as usual. The 6 volumes were finished. She had begun organizing the final summary document, which would accompany her father's clinical records to the committee. The work had entered its last stage, which had a different quality from the working stages, more careful, more aware of itself as a thing that would be read by people who had not been present for its construction. Carlyle was not there. She worked for 2 hours alone, which was how the arrangement had begun and felt, therefore, like a return to something rather than an absence. She organized. She cross-referenced. She wrote the summary headings in her neatest hand, leaving space for the content to follow. At 12:30 she finished the headings and sat back and looked at the shelves. She had been borrowing books from these shelves since October. In the early weeks she had taken them home and returned them on Thursdays. In the later weeks she had often read them here, in the hour before he arrived or the half hour after he left. She knew the shelves now with the particular familiarity of a place you have spent enough time in to stop consciously seeing. On the third shelf from the bottom, behind a row of agricultural surveys that she had never had reason to move, there was a small volume with no title on its spine. She did not know what made her notice it that day when she had not noticed it on the other days. She moved the agricultural surveys. She took it out. It was a journal. The cover was plain, slightly water damaged at one corner, not the water damage of flooding but the water damage of something that had been in a room where there was illness, where cloths were wetted and wrung. The handwriting inside was a woman's, small and regular. The handwriting of someone who had been taught to write carefully and had kept the habit. The first entry was dated June 1815. Sarah stood very still with the journal in her hands. She should put it back. This was not hers to read. She had not been given permission, had not been told it existed. Had found it by the particular accident of a Thursday without him and an idle hand that had moved an agricultural survey for no reason she could name. She read the first entry: William has gone to Edinburgh for the committee. Francis thinks it is very grand and has been telling everyone at length about parliamentary procedure, which she has assembled from novels and has therefore largely invented. I have not corrected her. The invented version is more interesting. Sarah sat down on the floor with her back against the shelves, which was not a dignified position and which she did not consider for even a moment. She read. Eleanor Carlyle had written every day from June through the middle of July. The entries were various observations about the household, about Francis reading, about the garden, about the particular quality of London in summer when the heat came and the city smelled of its own density. They were the entries of a woman who paid attention to specific things and found them worth recording. In July the entries shortened. The handwriting remained regular but the sentences became more economical, the way writing became when the writer was tired and conserving effort. July 9. Francis is worse today. I have sent for Dr. Marsh again. He came but did not stay. He said he would return tomorrow. He seemed, I don't know the word. I am trying not to supply words from my own fear. July 11. Dr. Marsh has not come. I have sent twice. The footmen are. I understand their fear. I do not excuse it but I understand it. I have been sitting with Frances myself. Someone should be with her. July 12. I asked Thomas to bring water from the kitchen. He did not come. I asked again. I went myself in the end. The kitchen is a long way when one is not well. I think I am not entirely well. July 13. I have put a pitcher of water beside Frances' bed so she does not have to ask. If William comes home before I want her to have water. That seems like the thing to make certain of. There was no July 14 entry. The next entry was in different handwriting, cramped and uncertain, a single line. Lady Carlyle passed this morning. Miss Frances Carlyle. The evening prior, Sarah sat on the floor of Lady Mortimer's library for a long time after that. she thought about a pitcher of water placed beside a bed by a woman who had walked a long way to fill it. Who had done it because she could not make anyone else do it and because she wanted her daughter to have water. She thought about Carlyle standing in front of a carved stone doorway, saying her water glass was empty. She thought about 23-year-old woman in Bermondsey who had learned to leave water beside her own bed. She thought about her father, who had driven to Southwark twice a year to see patients that other physicians had decided were not worth the journey. She stood up. Her legs were stiff from the floor. She put the journal back exactly as she had found it behind the agricultural surveys, spine inward. Water damaged corner to the left. She replaced the surveys in their original positions. She sat down at the desk and looked at the summary heading she had written. The December committee session was in 3 weeks. She picked up her pencil. She added a line to the summary document. In the space she had left beneath the heading Clinical Context, the following records were maintained by Dr. Thomas Bellamy over a period of 20 years, at personal cost and without institutional support. In the belief that accurate data was the prerequisite for any adequate response. He did not live to see them used. She looked at the line, she left it, she packed her things, put on her coat, and walked home through the December cold with the distinct sensation of a person who has been altered by an hour in a way that will take considerably longer to fully account for. She was awake when he knocked, not the side door knocked the front door, at 10:30 at night. Which was a different kind of declarative entirely. She heard it from her room, heard Margaret's maid go to answer it, heard the low exchange of voices, heard Margaret's footsteps on the stairs. It's Carlyle, Margaret said, through the door. He says it's important, he'll come down. Sarah said. She came down that he was standing in Margaret's front parlor, which was a room designed for morning calls, and looked somewhat bewildered to contain him at this hour. He had his coat still on. He had not, apparently, intended to stay long enough to remove it. He looked at her when she came in, and something in his face shifted. A careful thing, a controlled thing, the expression of a man who had been holding a position for several hours and had reached the room where he could set it down. Eversham's votes. He said, yes, Sarah said. She sat down, because standing felt performative. You said you'd found alternatives that I had. He reached into his coat and removed a document folded, sealed with 3 signatures. The kind of document that was written to be official rather than personal. He set it on the table between them. Whitmore, Castle, and Hayes. Signed this afternoon. The December session proceeds through the secondary committee structure. Eversham's 3 votes are no longer necessary. Sarah looked at the document. She did not pick it up. When did you start working on this? She said, Tuesday of last week. He said. When Eversham's letter arrived, she looked up. You had this 3 days ago, she said. Before I cancelled the library arrangement. Yes, you didn't tell me that. I was going to tell you on Thursday, he said. You cancelled the arrangement on Wednesday evening. A pause. Brief and precise. I came to the side door on Thursday instead. I told you I was looking for a 4th option. You told me you were looking, Sarah said. You didn't tell me you'd found it 3 days earlier. No, he said. I didn't. She looked at him. Why? He was quiet for a moment, not the evasive quiet of someone avoiding an answer, but the considered quiet of someone locating the accurate one. Because I wanted to tell you in person, he said. Not in a note. Not through an intermediary. I wanted to. He stopped. Started again. With the precision of a man who had learned to say exactly what he meant because he had watched imprecision cost too much. I wanted to see your face when you understood that leaving wasn't necessary. I wanted to be present for that. Sarah sat with that for a moment. The parlor was lit by 2 candles. Yes, which was insufficient for the room and sufficient for this. Outside, London made its nighttime sounds, distant carriage wheels, the occasional voice, the city conducting its late business with its usual indifference to what was happening in Margaret's front parlor. There's something else. He said. She waited. The summary document, he said. The line you added today. Under clinical context. He looked at her steadily. Lady Mortimer mentioned you had been in the library. I went to check the document after. Sarah thought about the line she had written and left. He did not live to see them used. That I should have asked before adding to the final document. She said. No, he said. It should be there. He paused. I want to add something beside it. What? He reached into his coat again and produced a second piece of paper, smaller. Personal rather than official. He set it beside the signed agreement. She picked it up. It was a proposed addition to the committee record's formal preamble, the section that would be printed and archived and cited in future committee work. It read: the evidentiary foundation of this report rests substantially on the clinical records of Dr. Thomas Bellamy, whose 20 years of documented practice in Herefordshire and London represent a standard of systematic observation that this committee is privileged to make use of. The correction and cross-referencing of this data was carried out by his daughter, Miss Sarah Bellamy, whose contribution to this work is hereby formally recognized. Sarah read it twice, her father's name. Her name. In the committee record, in the preamble. In the section that would be cited, she had asked for his name to be recorded as a contributing source. He had written this. She looked up. Her voice, when it came, was steady in the way it was steady when she was working to keep it that way. Which was different from the steadiness of composure but required the same face. You didn't have to. She began. That he spent 20 years, Carlyle said, quietly, being told his evidence wasn't the right kind. You told me that. He looked at the paper in her hands. The right kind is whatever was true and carefully recorded. His was both. A pause. And yours? She set the paper down beside the signed agreement. The two documents side by side on Margaret's morning call table. You went to Lady Mortimer's library tonight, she said. After Whitmore and Castle and Hayes signed. Yes.to read what ID added. Yes. He looked at her directly. With the full weight of that attention she had been cataloguing since October. You wrote that he didn't live to see them used. He paused. I wanted to tell you that he will have lived to see them used. Because they are being used. The distinction matters. Sarah looked at the candle on the table to her left, which was burning with the patient steadiness of a candle that had no opinion about what was happening in its vicinity. I in the library today, she said. I found a journal. He went very still, behind the agricultural surveys. She said. Third shelf from the bottom. I moved them by accident. She looked at him. I read it. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a long moment. You read it, he said. Yes, all of it, through July 13th, she said. And the last entry, the candle burned. Outside. The carriage sounds had faded into the particular quiet of the late-night city. In the silence between them there was the weight of Eleanor Carlyle writing alone in a July bedroom and the weight of a pitcher of water placed beside a bed by a woman walking farther than she should have needed to walk. She put water beside Frances' bed, Sarah said. When no one would bring it. So Frances would have it. I know. He said. She wrote it down. She wrote it down so that Sarah stopped. Found the steady voice. I think she wrote it down so that it wouldn't be as though it hadn't happened. So there would be a record of her having done it. He said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The expression on his face was the one she had seen briefly in all the previous months, the one that stopped being managed and it was fully present now, which was different, which was something she was going to need time to fully account for. You kept it, she said. It was supposed to be. Yes. He said. I kept it. You're the only person who knew it existed. Yes, he said. Until today. She looked at him. You are, he said. The first person who has touched it. Since. He stopped. You moved the surveys back exactly as they were. You put the journal back exactly as you found it. He paused. I checked that. I thought you might, she said. Why did you put it back? He said. Rather thorny. Don't know. Leaving it somewhere visible. Letting me know you'd found it in a way that gave me the option to. Because it wasn't mine to move. Sarah said. It was yours. I wasn't going to take it out of the place where you'd kept it without your permission. She paused. But I'm not going to pretend I didn't read it. He was looking at her with an expression she had no existing category for. No. He said. I didn't think you would. The 2 candles burned. The city was quiet. The signed agreement and the proposed preamble edition lay side by side on the table, and Sarah's father's notation paper was in her coat pocket. And somewhere in Lady Mortimer's library there was a journal behind an agricultural survey with a water-damaged corner. She would have. He started. I know, Sarah said quietly. I think so too. He looked at the table. Then at her. Thursday. He said. It was not Thursday's usual meaning. It was a different question. Wearing Thursday's clothing, Sarah looked at him for a moment, at the coat he still had on, at the 2 documents he had brought, at the expression that had stopped being managed. Yes. She said. Thursday, the December session of the secondary committee was held on a Thursday, which Sarah had not planned and which felt, nonetheless, like the kind of coincidence that was not entirely coincidental. She had not been invited. She had not expected to be. The committee's work was her father's records and her cross-referencing and the corrected mortality data from 7 volumes of parish records. But the committee itself was a room of men with institutional authority, and she was a young woman who borrowed books from Lady Mortimer's library and had been losing invitations at a rate of approximately 2 per week since October. She heard about the session from Graves Dr. Graves, who had been at Mrs. Alden's gathering in November and had known her father's fever papers and had, in the intervening weeks, become a careful and reliable correspondent on matters of public health. He had been granted an observer's position at the session. He wrote to her afterward. The presentation went as planned. The corrected data was accepted without significant challenge. The misclassification pattern was to consist and to dispute. Your father's clinical records were entered into evidence as a primary source. Carlyle read the preamble edition himself. Which I thought you should know. There was a moment when he read your father's name and the room was, I don't have a better word for it than attentive. They understood what they were looking at. The 3 conditional votes did not appear. Eversham was present but said little. The secondary committee S. Structure held. The session passed. Sarah read the letter at breakfast on Friday morning, then read it again. Then folded it and put it in her pocket beside the notation paper. The session had passed. Mandatory fever reporting. Compulsory parish record standards. A public health board with actual authority to compel compliance. The things her father had submitted evidence for in 1812 and been told were premature, unnecessary, an overreach of institutional authority into matters best left to local discretion. She sat at Margaret's breakfast table for a longer time than breakfast warranted. The legislation existed now in the world. It would be challenged, amended, argued over in the Lords and then the Commons, and it would take months and possibly years before it became the law it was intended to be. Her father had known this. He had understood, better than most, the distance between evidence and action. But the session had passed. The evidence was in the record. The argument had been made in a room with authority and had not been defeated. He had not lived to see it. He had lived to make it possible, which was not the same thing, but was, as Carlyle had said, a distinction that mattered. The gathering that evening was at Lord Ashford's house, which was large enough to hold 200 guests without difficulty and had been doing so since the Restoration. A fact that the architecture communicated clearly and without apology. Sarah had been invited 3 weeks prior, before the rumor, before the invitations had thinned. She had considered not going. Margaret had said, with the particular gentleness she used for things she felt strongly about, that Sarah should go, and that she should wear the green dress. And that some rooms were worth walking into even when you were not certain of the reception. She went. She wore the green dress. The first hour was unremarkable. She spoke to Mrs. Pemberton about nothing consequential. She accepted a glass of wine she didn't drink. She stood near a window and had the room conduct itself and thought about a session she hadn't attended and a letter folded in her pocket and mandatory fever reporting. She was considering whether it was yet late enough to leave without discourtesy when she saw him. He arrived at 8:30. Which was later than was fashionable and earlier than was dramatic, and the room did what rooms did when he entered, the careful, automatic rearrangement of bodies and attention, the social tide going out around him. He was in formal dress, which she had not seen before. It changed nothing about the way he occupied a room. Which was as though the room were a place he was passing through rather than a place constructed for his benefit. That he saw her almost immediately. She was not close. There were 40 people between them at least, but his eyes moved through the room with the efficiency of a man who had entered it looking for something specific, and when they reached her they stopped. That he crossed the room, not directly. There were people to acknowledge, the social navigation of 200 guests that could not be entirely bypassed. But his direction was consistent, and the room, Sarah noticed this. She watched attention shift and follow, the way attention did when someone with social weight moved with intention. Conversations paused and resumed. Positions subtly reoriented. He reached her. "Miss Bellamy," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "That I have something to tell you," he said. "That I should have told you last night and didn't, because I hadn't yet decided how." She waited. "The session passed," he said. "That I heard from Graves," she said. "This morning." Something moved through his expression. He wrote quickly. He knew I'd want to know. "Yes." A pause. "I should have written myself. I intended to." He looked at her steadily. "I came here instead." Around them, the gathering continued its business conversations. The movement of servants with trays, the ambient sound of 200 people in a room designed to hold them. Sarah was aware of it the way you were aware of weather, present, noted, not the thing you were paying attention to, the preamble. She said. "Graves said you read it yourself." "Yes, you read his name, and yours," he said. "Both of them are in the record. Permanently." He paused. "I wanted you to know that I read them aloud in a room that will not be able to claim, afterward, that it did not hear them." She looked at him. "Your father knew," Carlyle said quietly, "that accurate records were the prerequisite for any adequate response. He kept them for 20 years without support, without recognition, without any certainty that they would ever be used. That is." He stopped. And she watched him locate the precise word. "Which took him a moment." "That is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing. And it should be said in rooms with the authority to make the saying permanent." The candles in Lord Ashford's ballroom were extensive and very bright. Sarah thought about grey library light and flat November light and the particular light that came through Margaret's breakfast room window on Friday mornings. "You built something," she said. "In those 3 years. Before I arrived that I built a framework," he said. "Your father built the foundation. I didn't know the foundation existed until you walked 12 feet across a rug and picked up a handkerchief." She was quiet for a moment. "That," she began. "True," he said simply. Around them the room had continued its subtle reorientation. She was aware, without looking directly, that they had been standing in conversation for long enough to have become visible, not as a scandal, not as anything Caroline Hartwell could deploy, but as a fact, 2 people in Lord Ashford's ballroom, speaking to each other with the quality of attention that was distinct from social conversation. She was aware that Caroline was present somewhere in the room. She was aware that Lady Mortimer was near the fireplace. She was aware that Lord Eversham was standing with a group near the east wall. And had, in the last 5 minutes, looked in their direction twice. She was aware of all of this the way she was aware of weather. Carlyle was also aware of it. She could see the awareness in him, the slight precision of a man who knew he was being observed and had made a decision about what that meant. "That I want to ask you something," he said. "In this room, with these people in it." She looked at him directly. "The work is finished," he said. "Or rather it's entered a new stage, which is the stage where other people take it forward. Your part of it, and mine, is done." He paused. "I find him not interested in going back to the previous arrangement." "What previous arrangement?" "The one where I stand at windows in drawing rooms and you sit in corners," he said, "and we are both very careful about the amount of space we occupy." She said nothing. She waited. Because he was assembling something specific and she had learned to give him the time that took. "That I would like," he said, with the precision of a man who had decided to say exactly what he meant and had done the work of finding out what that was, "to court you. With intention. Formally. If you're willing. In the way that requires me to call on your nearest male relation, which will be complicated, since I believe your nearest male relation is your father's brother in Hereford, who I haven't met, and that will require a letter and then a journey. And I'd rather know first whether the letter and the journey are worth undertaking from your perspective. Sarah looked at him, behind him. The room was very still in the way that rooms went still when something was happening in them that 200 people wanted to witness without appearing to witness. She was aware of Caroline, somewhere to her left. She was aware of Eversham near the east wall, who had now looked in their direction 4 times. She was aware of Lady Mortimer by the fireplace, who had stopped speaking to her companion. She was aware of all of it, and of the fact that he had said this here, in this room, in front of these people. Not because he had miscalculated the audience but because he had calculated it exactly and decided this was precisely where it should be said. The letter and the journey, she said, would not be wasted. Something happened to his expression, the full version of the thing she had been seeing in fragments since October, assembled and present and not being managed at all. Then he'll write to Hereford tomorrow, he said. Damn, why uncle prefers directness, she said. He's very like my father in that. Good, he said. So do I. The room around them exhaled, collectively and very quietly. In the way that rooms exhaled when something had happened in them and they were still deciding what it meant. Sarah could feel its subtle shift of 200 people updating their understanding of an evening. She looked at him. You came here, she said, knowing I might say no. Yes. He said, and you were going to ask anyway. Yes. He met her eyes. I have learned, from a woman I greatly respect, that the most dangerous thing is looking away when looking away is easier. A pause. Brief and complete. I decided not to look away. She was very still for a moment, not with uncertainty, but with the particular quality of stillness that came when a thing landed fully and you needed a moment to hold the weight of it. Your mother's phrase, she said. Yes. He said. And yours. Across the room, in her peripheral vision, she saw Eversham turn away. She saw Caroline's fan move in the mechanical way fans moved when their holders needed to be doing something with their hands. She saw Lady Mortimer, by the fireplace, watching them with an expression that was not the expression of a woman who found this surprising, but the expression of a woman who had been waiting to see what would happen and had now seen it. The session passed. Sarah said, yes. He said, damn, why father's name is in the record, permanently. He said, and mine, and yours. She looked at him, at the man who had stood at windows in drawing rooms for 3 years and let the silence be what it was, who had found 3 votes in 2 days and come to a side door to say so. Who had kept a journal in a library behind agricultural surveys for 7 years and checked that she had put it back exactly as she'd found it. Write to Hereford, she said. That he inclined his head, a small movement, precise and unambiguous. Shall we? He began. Yes. She said. Let's walk. They walked through Lord Ashford's ballroom together, through the 200 people who had gone very quiet and then begun, carefully, to talk again. Through the candlelight and the weather of the room and the particular attentiveness of people who understood they were witnessing something being made permanent. Sarah did not look at Eversham, she did not look at Caroline, she looked at the door at the end of the room. And at the man beside her, and at the distance between where she was and where she was going, which was 12 feet, or perhaps considerably more than that, or perhaps exactly the right length. Spring came early to Southwark that year, which the hospital's head nurse mentioned in passing as though it were unremarkable, which perhaps it was. The extension had been completed in March. It added a second ward and a proper dispensary and a room for training the nurses who were being recruited from 3 parishes, which had been Carlyle's addition to the original plan and which Sarah had reviewed in December and suggested expanding by 1 room, which he had done without argument and without pointing out that she was not technically part of the planning committee. She was, now, technically part of the planning committee. This had been arranged quietly and recorded formally, which was how he arranged things. They stood in front of the building on a Tuesday in April, which was not a Thursday but had become, over the past 4 months, the kind of day that felt structural anyway. The door had a new panel beside the original lintel. The carving was the same quality, the same stone, the same craftsman, but the inscription was different. It read, in memory of Eleanor Carlyle and Francis Carlyle, and in recognition of Dr. Thomas Bellamy of Hereford, that no one should wait alone. Sarah read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly, the way you read things you wanted to keep accurately. He would have, she began, that I know, Carlyle said. She looked at the names. Eleanor and Francis. Who had been here first? Her father's name beside them, in the same stone, permanent in the same way. She lifted her hand and placed it against the carved panel. The stone was cold from the April morning, and slightly rough under her fingertips. And very solid in the way that carved stone was solid permanence as a physical fact rather than a promise. She was aware of him beside her, the quality of his stillness. Then his hand covered hers, not over the stone, placed his hand over hers, his palm against her knuckles. The warmth of it against the cold of the stone and her cold fingers, an inch of contact that was nothing like the inch of careful distance in a handkerchief exchange 8 months before. She did not move her hand, that he did not move his. They never met, she said. My father and your mother. No. He said, but they were doing the same thing. Yes. I in the same city. In the same years. She looked at the names. He submitted his papers to the society in 1812. Was she in London then? She was always in London. He said. She preferred it to the estate. A pause. She used to say that the city had the virtue of making the problems visible. In the country you could pretend they were someone else's. Sarah thought about her father driving to Southwark twice a year from Hereford. Which was not the country pretending, but was something in between. A man who could see the problem and kept traveling toward it despite not having the authority to fix it. They would have argued, she said, almost certainly. He agreed. She argued with everyone she respected. She said it was how you found out what they actually thought, and why father was the same. Sarah looked at her hand under his on the cold stone. He used to say that the people who didn't argue with you were the people who had already decided you weren't worth the effort. Then they would have argued extensively, Carlyle said, and thought very well of each other. She smiled, which she hadn't planned to do and which felt, therefore, entirely genuine. Yes. She said. I think so. The April morning was quiet around them, not the managed quiet of rooms full of people performing inattention, but the actual quiet of a street in Southwark on a Tuesday, the city going about its ordinary business with its ordinary sounds. Unconcerned with what was happening in front of a hospital door, she had learned, over 8 months of Thursday silences, to trust the weight of quiet. To let it hold what it was holding without pressing it to become something else. She stood with his hand over hers on the cold carved stone and looked at the names Eleanor, Francis. Thomas. Anne thought about water carried a long distance and records kept without recognition and a handkerchief on a Persian rug, in the particular quality of a man who came to side doors and wrote letters to Hereford and placed a hand over hers without saying anything that didn't need to be said. Stone was warming slowly under their hands. That seemed, she thought, like the right kind of ending for a Tuesday in April. Or perhaps not an ending, perhaps her father's word, the one he used when he was about to say something had been patient about for a long time, perhaps a beginning. Which was after all what accurate records were always for.